For our next task, we're asked to install and configure an RODC, a read-only domain controller, which during the introduction I already kind of pitched as the solution for a very specific use case. Remember, the whole point behind Active Directory and its multi-master model is that an Active Directory domain controller in one location has essentially the same copy or view of the database as does every other DC in the entire Active Directory domain. Now, this is great because every single domain controller can be a writable domain controller. However, every single domain controller, as you can imagine, contains every single object in Active Directory. Now, in a world where our domain controllers can be locked behind closed doors, that's a perfectly acceptable thing. A would-be attacker would have to break into our offices, and then once inside, break further into the data center itself in order to find and then take off with that domain controller server itself. Once that person had the server, well, then they could dismount the operating system, boot it from some Linux Live CD, for example, and then with that dismounted operating system, hack into the Active Directory database and extract out all your usernames and passwords. You can imagine that in an environment that had tens or thousands of different usernames and passwords, well, the loss of a single Active Directory domain controller, because it wasn't properly secured, could mean the re-permissioning, the re-passwording of every single user. Now, for that reason, Microsoft includes this RODC role that, again, is only intended when you have a domain controller that you, for some reason, cannot lock away. If you're not entirely confident of the physical security of that DC, well, when you promote a server to a domain controller, which is what we'll do here in just a second, you would promote it not to a standard DC, but instead as a read-only domain controller. Now, as you can see here, I've already used the Add Roles and Features wizard to install the ADDS role onto this machine, and now we need to go through the process of actually promoting this machine to a domain controller. We will be promoting this DC to our existing domain, so this is our company.pri domain, and we'll use my credentials here in order to perform the operation. Here under Domain Controller Options is where we can then choose what configuration we want for this RODC. Here we need to actually configure it as an RODC, but perhaps in our case, not a domain name server. In your environment, you may want to also make it a DNS server so that your local clients can resolve off of it. But for the purposes of simplicity, we'll just make this an RODC and a global catalog. I'll include this server in our default first site name because we haven't talked much about sites here just yet, and then punch in our DSRM password. So there's the password and there's the password again. If I choose next here, these are the additional options that you get whenever you create an RODC. And it's when you create that RODC first where you have the opportunity to configure what is called a delegated administrator account. Now, as you can imagine, in an office where you have a situation where you can't actually lock the domain controller behind closed doors, the likelihood that that office is a really remote office is probably pretty high. And because of that, you actually making your way physically to that location to perform services or to update the machine or do whatever else is required for the everyday maintenance of a Windows server is probably something you don't want to have to do. The problem with a regular domain controller, however, is that an administrator on the DC is automatically a domain administrator. And so you probably don't want your remote site person to be a full domain admin. And so here, when you create this RODC, you can actually create a delegated administrator account of a person that perhaps doesn't need to be a domain admin, but needs to be able to perform various management tasks on this server. I'm actually not going to configure this here now because I want to show you the location where you can configure that after you've gone through the RODC promotion process. Now, it's not only the creation of the RODC, but also how the RODC replicates passwords down that are the reason why you create it for those unsecured situations. Down here, you can see two different dialog boxes for different groups that are either allowed to replicate passwords to this DC or denied from replicating passwords to this DC. It is in this location where if you have multiple different remote sites, one for different geographic locations, it's probably a good idea for you to configure multiple different replication groups for each site so that you further constrain down just which passwords are going to be on this machine. Remember again that the whole point here is that if a person steals this RODC, well then they're only going to get the passwords that happen to be on that machine. Now, you as a domain admin also have a little extra effort that you have to think about anytime you attempt to use this RODC. You would not, for example, want your administrators group or the company administrators group to have their passwords locally on this machine. Same thing with server operators and backup operators and account operators, as well as this group here called Deny RODC Password Replication Group. It is generally a best practice for you to enter in any groups or users who have elevated privileges so that their passwords are not replicated to this machine. That prevents the person who stole the RODC from getting the password of a user that's perhaps a domain admin. And so you'll see these groups that are created. You can add or remove them or create your own groups if you want. I would create those that are specific to the RODC, and I would also make sure that any person with elevated privileges is automatically added here to the denied RODC password replication group. It's in fact both of these groups that provide the actual reason why the RODC exists. So let's click Next here, and then go to the next item in the screen where we can configure the additional options. Most of the rest of this here has to do with any domain controller, RODC or not. We won't do an install from media. We'll replicate from any domain controller. We'll use the standard paths here for ADDS, and then we'll choose the next button and then ultimately the install button here to complete the installation of our RODC. So let me go ahead and hit the install button and then accelerate things to the other end of the reboot. So I'm back here on RODC1, and now that we are a fully functional domain controller, I can bring up Active Directory users and computers and go through some of the additional management tasks that you may wish to do here on this machine. There are just a couple of which that we took a look at already as part of the install, but I want to show you, should you need to make changes, where you would go about doing so, because it's not immediately obvious. Back here under Active Directory Users and Computers, if we take a look under the Domain Controllers OU, you can see this machine RODC1 that's configured as a read-only machine here. It's actually on the computer object itself where we end up configuring a lot of the different extra parameters associated with this being an RODC. The first of which is right here, the password replication policy, where you'll see configured the allow and deny settings for any of these groups that were part of that original installation process. So it's here where you would add additional groups if you wanted to be those where your password was replicated down. You could also here under Advanced identify then the actual accounts themselves that have been replicated down to this RODC. So you can see here that the computer account for RODC1 has been downloaded, and this Kerberos ticket granting ticket user has been downloaded as well. So it's here where you can actually identify which users have their passwords on this machine, as well as should you have need to repopulate those passwords, you can do so down here. You can also, with the resultant policy up here, identify which potential users and computers will be downloaded as part of the different policies that you've set up in the previous screen. So this gives you an idea, at least helps you understand what kinds of users are going to be able to authenticate against this RODC. Now remember, anybody whose password is not on this RODC will still be able to authenticate in that remote site. However, in order to be able to do so, that person would have to have access to a full DC somewhere else on the network. So the RODC could authenticate in a situation where the network was severed to the rest of the domain, but only for those accounts that happen to be in that local machine, those that you'll see here in the resultant policy view, or those whose accounts and the passwords have been brought down over here in the policy usage view. I do want to, if I hit the close button here, show you one more location. It's right here under Managed By, where if I click the Change button up here, I can identify which group of users should have access to administer this RODC. So like my IT group, for example, here in company.pri. This IT group now could perform all the usual management tasks of dealing with this as being a Windows server, but would have no access to do anything associated with Active Directory, the things commonly associated with account operators and domain admins. Now there is one other command that I want to show you as well, and that actually happens back on a fully fledged DC over here. If I flip over to dc.company.pri, I actually want to show you one more command that may come in handy in a very rare situation where you have a machine that you need to pre-stage and then deliver to that remote site, and then have that not quite domain admin person promote it in that remote location to become an RODC. Now, as I said, this is kind of an edge case here, but at least it's a command you should be prepared for, called add ADDS read-only domain controller account. And the only thing I want to show you is the fact that this is where you would go through pre-staging the Active Directory account so that that other person could potentially just promote that RODC into Active Directory.